Hey, welcome everybody. We're glad you're tuning in with us right now, and I'm here with Steve Karnum, and you perhaps have seen the previous podcast or YouTube videos that we've done. Today we're covering a very sensitive and really kind of a popular subject in our culture right now, and it really is about the gender fluid issue, or as one of my favorite books, the gender dysphoria of our current culture. And so we're back with Steve, who's a licensed counselor, and trying to get an expert's take on this. And so, Steve, before we open up, is there anything that you want to say as we see more and more kids, and we were just discussing this, it's becoming popular and more kids. We have a third grader who said to me last week at church, every one of my classmates has said they're bisexual, they're lesbian, they're transsexual, and again, some of that's it's just popular to do right now. But it leads to some dangerous places to go. So is there anything you want to open up before I go into the list of questions with you?
Well, I just think that in our desire to break away from maybe Victorian ideas about sexuality, we've overshot the mark at times, and hence we've sped everything up to where, we're making kids, maybe not making them, but they feel pressure at a very early age to make some kind of choice about things that have to do with sexuality, and they ought to get to be third graders and not have to decide something like that because they're not prepared to decide it.
Right. So let's go into that then. So I'm a parent, and here comes my third grader, here comes my sixth grader, and, whatever age you want to place there, and they say, hey, I think I'm gender fluid, or hey, my friend says I'm actually bisexual. How should I respond as a parent to that?
The first thing I think most parents need to do is to determine, when their child tells them something like that, to help their child define what it is that they're saying, what they know that they're saying, or what they're aware of, because lots of times kids at a young age are learning to parrot phrases and words that they really don't understand. So, I think I'd get some clarification from the kid about what he means when he says that, because he may mean something that's very innocuous or that he's unaware of. He may be and then to help him see that, he may be saying something that he was unaware what it meant. So that's the first thing I'd do.
Sure. And that makes complete sense, because you don't want to be talking about something and the kid's like, I have no idea what you're talking. What are you talking about?
Exactly.
So let's and we do this any kind of, let's get our terms right. Let's get our okay.
Well, I had a boy in counseling not long ago who's, I believe, a sixth grader, and he said, well, I guess I'm bisexual. And I said, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, I accept both girls and boys. I try not to judge any of them. I said, about what? And it was obvious that it had absolutely nothing to do with sexuality. It had to do, his perception was that he needed to be accepting and loving of both sexes. Well, acceptance is one thing, involvement's a whole other. So
yeah, that's huge, acceptance and involvement. Yeah. And so I'm a parent. We kind of come to common terminology and common phrases. But let me ask this before we get there, to help our parents come the common terminology. One of the popular phrases right now is gender fluid.
Yeah.
So what does that mean?
Depends on who you talk to, probably. Depends on whether you're talking to the kid, the parent, the clinician, or something else. But I guess gender fluidity is nothing more than someone who's in flux, and maybe he's going to identify as a male and maybe a female, and maybe she's going to identify as a female, maybe a male, maybe something in between. And so therefore it becomes a fluid or dynamic process rather than something that's static and fixed in some people's minds.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that, again, is interesting as we talk about this, and now we've kind of defined at least gender fluid a little bit, one of the mistakes that I know that parents make is kind of this freaking out, overreacting, and again, part of that's because you have an idea what that means, and your child doesn't. So how do I help parents, first of all, just go, hey, take a step back and go, breathe.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, what they said doesn't mean this is, even if they absolutely know what they're talking about, this isn't a sentence for life that they're going to live into.
Right.
So how do we help parents take that step back? And
Well, one is we help parents be realistic and talk to their kids on a level that allows their kids to be open. In other words, initially to say, "You're what?" that pushes anybody back. Whereas to say, "Well, okay, it's interesting you say that. Tell me what you mean by that,
Yeah.
or what's going on that makes you feel that way, or whatever." Because 9 times out of 10, their definition and yours doesn't always match, or the typical definition and their definition doesn't match. So get them to talk about it and make it safe enough. Parenting, talking with your kids, you're not going to get them to talk by forcing them or by, trying to trick them in some way or whatever. You have to make it emotionally safe enough for them to be able to share what they think and feel, because they're going to have a ton of questions, and they're not always going to ask them if they don't feel safe emotionally.
right, and so some of that, especially to our parents with younger children, is to create that safe environment long before you get to the question. And we like to say, have some of those conversations long before you get there.
Exactly.
And so, like at our dinner table, we try to have conversations about, hey, can you have a different truth than I have?
Yeah.
Well, the answer is no. You can have a different opinion than I have.
Right.
And then, is it okay if our opinion is different? Like, can I still respect you, or does that make me evil? And again, you're laying the groundwork ultimately to have some of those tougher conversations.
Sure, very much.
All right, so here would be the next question. What are the positive and or negative effects? I just want to make the question neutral for you, if you will. But a lot of our parents are actually encouraging their children to test this. And I can't tell you how many really good, what I would call good parents, who are saying, yeah, that's okay. And I'm kind of shaking my head going, I don't think you understand the psychological damage that potentially is going on right now. So give us some of the again, if there's any positives, but give us some of what's going on behind that, positive or negative.
Well, when a young person tells me something like they're questioning their gender identity or, their sexual roles and so forth, one of the things I say is, well, I'm glad you're thinking about that. In other words, don't shame them for thinking it. But on the other hand, if they're asking a question, they're looking for perspective. So to me, that's an open door to be able to talk about things. My perspective, though, is if a young person comes to talk about heterosexuality, I'm not going to tell them to experiment with that when they're 13 and figure out, what they know and think and feel and everything else. I mean, so why would we do the same thing with some other sort of gender fluid, bisexual, homosexual kind of thing anyway? In other words, my position always is, if you're a teenager and you've got serious questions about your sexuality, let's talk about it. That's super important to talk about. But why not put it on a shelf in terms of any kind of experiential sort of thing, because they're not prepared to have a sexual relationship, period, end of conversation. They're 15 or 16 years old. So the best thing they can do at that point is to say, okay, let's sit that on the shelf. We'll come back to, some sort of final decision. But for now, let's talk about what that means. Talking about it's one thing. Experimenting, I think, that's an open door to all kinds of chaos.
Right. And I think that's huge, the difference that you keep bringing up between an involvement or participation in and talking about it, thinking about it, and even believing that you're into some other place. We talk about that a lot as a church about, hey, we all wrestle with temptations.
Well, sure.
It's not a sin to wrestle with a temptation
Right.
or to be tempted. That's not a sin. The sin is the involvement in and participation
Right.
in. Yeah.
And kids who are teenagers they're pretty inquisitive, whether it's about sexuality or about anything else for that matter. And we ought to be there with some answers and ideas and material to give them and everything else, but that doesn't mean we send them on some mission to, go experiment.
Right, right. So let me ask this from a psychological point to kind of one of the things that I love about you, and again, I say to people all the time, there's a difference between a counselor and a Christian counselor. And a lot of that is because of your worldview and what you believe morally.
Right.
And of course, I love the phrase, you can't be doing good therapy without good theology. Yeah. Because ultimately you're sending them off on a path of lies. So when you wrestle with this and when you deal with kids, obviously you're helping them, but your worldview has some opinions on this. The Scripture has some opinions on this.
Right. We have to have something that grounds us to the truth, and yet at the same time, we're and we. When I say we, I mean believers in general, the church in general. There's rightly been some criticism leveled at us for being judgmental, harsh, negative, unengaging about things, not willing to talk about stuff. We shut people off, that sort of thing. There's no room for that. We ought to be accepting of the person. Doesn't mean we have to accept what they're doing as the best choice possible. But I think, and we tend to give up on people too easily. Once somebody's headed down one path, then it's like, well, so much for that. They're lost. And that doesn't, one of the best things we can do is continue to be accepting of them, but not, endorsing some, off-base conclusions or beliefs.
Yeah. Which is a great segue into our next question, which when I was a kid, you were part of the in group if you were wearing the right clothes. Mm-hmm. If you had the Aeropostale and I don't even know what they were because I was never on the inside of that, but and
that's right. You had the right tennis shoes.
Yeah. And so you were on the outside if you weren't wearing the right clothes. And here's again one of the new interesting pieces of pressure for our children. So an example is here's the fifth grader, and again I hope parents are hearing. These are actual stories that I get as a pastor. The third, first, and fifth grade are not too. Yes. I mean, that's when you start hearing about this. But so here's my third or fifth grader, and they went along with it. Said, "Yeah, I might be a lesbian." And again, they may or may not have known the terms or the title, but now they're saying, "Yeah, I've talked with my family. I'm not sure. I kind of like Jimmy. I want Jimmy to be my boyfriend." Mm-hmm. What I see now is that I'm hearing from parents and kids saying, well, then all my friends didn't like me. They said I'm intolerant of them, which I'm like, wait, you're in third grade and you guys know the word intolerant? Well, they don't know what the real word means, but again, whatever society has said. So now that they're outcasts, they've lost all their friends, and it's an entirely different set of peer pressure than really what I think we grew up with. So.
Sure.
What do you recommend there for a parent who's struggling with their son or daughter who suddenly, again, all their friends are criticizing them and telling them that they're bigots, that they're, again, intolerant? What do I do as a parent there?
Well, number one, I think parents have the freedom to be involved in their kids' lives on a lot of levels, and so one might be to help the process of, maybe finding some other peer group people to be connected with other than the ones that are rejecting the kid. Second is to tell their child, well, don't be guilty of what they're doing. In other words, don't be casting them out or rejecting them. Be accepting of who they are. Just disagree with what they believe. And I think too, to begin encouraging the youngster to find other peers that are more accepting of them. That's the irony behind the whole issue of judgment and so forth. We talk about a lot of acceptance, and yet sometimes the people who want their views to be accepted are very rejecting of people who don't own the same views. So it's a tightrope that we have to walk. But I think that's another reason why parents ought to recruit people who reinforce their beliefs. They ought to be involved in their kids' lives, not controlling everything, but exposing them to people who have a good moral base, and that that their beliefs are somewhat predictable. Also, to give kids something else to spend their energy on, other than debating that and being caught up in too much peer pressure, and and for whatever it's worth too. Now, this isn't a podcast on video games, but a lot of kids, the draw on video games is if they play online, is that becomes their peer group,
right,
is who they play with. Well, you might want to know what kind of input your kids are getting from that peer group, because that peer group's not always the same one as the one they hang out with on Thursday night. So,
right. And I appreciate that, because what you're saying is hey, we can't rescue the kid from that situation.
Not completely, no.
But and I say this as a parent who hates these conversations, but then, as I calm down and really, hey, I love my kid, we're really just saying to the kid, hey, when you stand up for truth, when you make a different decision, it's not always going to be what everybody else agrees with, and so we're training them to be adults.
That's right.
We're raising them up to be mature. You don't have to always follow the crowd. In fact, again, Jesus pretty much says, hey, not everybody's going to like you if you follow me. And so there's an awesome moment to say, hey, Jesus was rejected over and over again, and to some degree this is what it means to be part of the, again, spiritual army of God.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. That's good. And I think to help kids recognize also that they don't have to go on some campaign to convince their friends differently, and they don't have to enter into some big debate, nor do they have to act judgmental or harsh toward those people. Let them be.
Right.
I think sometimes if we can teach kids to be self-sufficient in the sense that they don't have to have their self-esteem bolstered all the time by a lot of other people, and they know what they believe going in, that's going to make it a whole lot better. In fact, there have been several studies done on this, and one of the markers that helps predict success as a young adult is the young person as a teenager, usually a later teen, are they able to move freely between one social group and another, numerous social groups, without being rejected. And that's a very good help in determining, or at least predicting, future success relationally, because those kids know how to connect with others without allowing the other person's demands to drive their behavior.
Yeah.
So,
They don't need to be needed.
Right.
And if you reject me, it's okay. It may hurt, but I'm going to move on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and they're not codependent. Or
Right.
Huge. And I love what you said about again, help them find other friends. I talk to parents, and every bit of church participation is a sacrifice.
Right.
I get it. There are people who say, hey, I'm at a place where church is my lifeline, and if I'm not there, my week's not right.
Right.
Great, because that's how it should be.
Sure.
There are other people who go, hey, church is hard to get to, and I go, yep, it's a sacrifice. There are Sundays as the pastor, I don't want to go.
Sure. Right.
But you're exposing your kids and yourself to, again, a group of peers who, hey, we understand this to be truth, and we're going to move towards this. And so we talk about the importance of youth group and of Sunday school and those places where they in theory are getting a common, again, moral viewpoint.
Right.
And that's powerful. That's
Right.
powerful.
Right. And to teach them, you may have the truth that doesn't allow you or it shouldn't encourage you to reject people who don't have the truth.
Absolutely.
That's why we hopefully maintain organizations and functions that are very accepting of kids who are different than the main kids in the group, but because they're accepting, that ministers to that young person. So
absolutely, and that's a big deal. And you brought this up twice now, where just because someone believes something doesn't mean we treat them unkindly.
Amen.
And that is exactly the message of Jesus.
That's right.
In fact, the people that Jesus, again, treated kind of harshly were the people who thought they had their act together.
Right. Yeah. Pharisees didn't fare well with Jesus.
Right. Yeah, the people farthest away from the truth and farthest away from Jesus often receive nothing but grace and love.
Right.
So, which is a great point then. How do we as a church, again, kids in the youth group, kids at school, we constantly hear, as you've already brought up, like, hey, we want to be open-minded, we want to be open-minded, but the minute I bring in and I don't mean this in a political, but a theological viewpoint, a conservative view, a biblical worldview, which again says, hey, I love you, but my worldview is based on Scripture. Scripture clearly says, look, homosexuality, again, this transgender idea is a sin. How do I interact with people who, again, immediately shut off and accuse me of being closed-minded? And there almost seems to be a lot of anger there. And I'm like, I don't know what to say to you. You're angry because, I'm not allowed to have a different... I'm not angry, but you're angry. Right. So how do I move forward?
I mean, I have to think about some of the interactions Jesus had when he was on earth that were, the woman at the well, woman caught in the act of adultery, a number of different places where his orientation was acceptance of the person, but at the same time, as he said, that woman caught in the act of adultery, go and sin no more, and so on. That there's acceptance, but clear cut. That's not probably a wise idea. Doesn't mean I don't love you, and that presents a tough kind of thing for most youth leaders because they'd love. I don't know, when I was a teacher at Christian school, I remember looking over my class list and going, oh, those are all pretty good kids. That's going to be an easy class. Well, that's a wrong way to look at it. You need to look at, and I remember having a class one time and thinking, man, if I get through the semester with them, they and I will both be lucky. But the truth is, those are the ones that you want to minister to the most, and you want to, by modeling it to other people, be accepting of them, but that doesn't mean you have to, be accepting of their views. And we don't have to get caught in a debate because a lot of times, you believe this, I believe that. I'll leave the change that needs to take place there to God. I'm just going to be the kind of person that is, open and honest and accepting of other people. So, and that's a hard thing to do sometimes because we kind of turn Christianity upside down, and instead of using the truths that God gave us to, live an effective life, we turn those into a measuring stick to see how good people are. And that's kind of really backwards from what Jesus wanted us to do.
Right, yeah. Jesus always said, the church, unfortunately, often holds people on the outside who don't believe accountable to our moral standards.
That's right.
And then we don't hold each other accountable to our moral standards, at least those are inside. And Jesus said, no. Hold those that are in the church who believe accountable. Those are outside. Don't be surprised when they live the way they do.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think there's some humor in the whole thing, too, that, Jesus didn't always choose to hang out with the people who were the squeaky clean ones either. And, part of that was to kind of make people think and do a little soul searching on their own, but also to model the idea like I'm accepting of them whether I believe what they believe or not.
Yeah.
So.
And I would say to parents, again, you can set up success later by having conversations now that are less touchy, if you will. And again, how often at our table, hey, if somebody likes a different flavor of ice cream, does that make them evil? No. And again, we talk about the difference between opinion and truth. And,
that's right.
Hey, if someone actually believes that Satan is God, how should we treat them? Should we bash them? Should we tell them that they're stupid? And, no, we should care for them. And when there's an open door, we can speak the truth, but not until the Holy Spirit opens the door. And I love the fact you said that's God's job. It's God's job to convert.
Well, and I think too, we all have a fear of what we aren't it's like, well, I chose not to be that way, but they kind of make me uncomfortable, or
Right.
I'm kind of fearful of their position. And if we can view that somewhat differently and deal with fear by just being open and honest and accepting of them, but again, being willing to give them an answer of what we believe, that's a whole lot better.
Yeah.
There's a lot to that. And what do we like when we see a movie is someone who's that way, loving and accepting, but their own person,
Yeah.
So.
I saw a report not too long ago that was saying that more and more parents and grandparents are forsaking what they believe,
Yeah.
because they don't want their grandson, granddaughter, their son or their daughter to reject them,
Yeah.
and to never come out and hang out with them, do Christmas and stuff. And it's an interesting culture where, again, we've given all this power and control to the kid or to the grandkid now. What do you say to, again, let's move the age group way up. Here's my young adult who says, I'm homosexual, I'm a lesbian, I'm transgender, whatever it is. And what do I say to the parent now as that kid's off in college or they're living in a relationship that, again, I disagree with? What do I say to that parent who, again, struggles with where's the line of saying, hey, here's what we believe, but we want you to know we love you?
Yeah. Well, I think the more you can say that, the better off you are. But I think the people who, if I ask a client, who are some of the people that have meant the most to you in your life, they don't typically name the people who are the most judgmental or who taught the most, biblical lessons to them in a verbal way, but more someone who is loving and accepting and kind and gracious, but also was their own person, So I think parents do themselves and their kids a big disservice if they go out on a limb and do the rejection thing, or if you continue this way, you can't be a part of our family. There's no place for that, I don't believe.
Right. Yeah, because that is really truth without love and grace, which isn't a model that Jesus gave us.
That's right.
Yeah, it may be true that that's a sin and it's not the right way to live, but I don't have to speak that or practice that without love and grace.
That's right.
But again, there's a balance there where, but there is truth in the midst of love and grace.
Sure there is.
And again, in fact, love isn't love unless it has boundaries.
Right.
And grace isn't
Exactly.
grace unless it demands transformation.
That's very true. Yeah, that's very true. I see that a lot. And again, sometimes parents and other people who are working with kids, teachers, educators, whoever, coaches, we want to get out there and declare the truth. Not that I'm not saying you have to spend years developing a relationship before you can disagree with someone, but I just think if you can make it very, very clear that you love the person, accept them for who they are, let's talk and let's dialogue about what your beliefs and my beliefs are, but also the ability to say, well, I wouldn't believe it this way and wouldn't take such a strong stand if I didn't believe that there was ultimately there were some moral guidelines that God gave, and that's what we're trying to abide by. Doesn't mean we hate you, doesn't mean we're going to throw you out because you don't see it that way, but we are hoping you can come to understand what the truth really is here.
That's right. So two things that I always try to remind, again, the parents and myself and others is, first of all, we're never defined by our sexuality.
Amen.
Like, we're always defined, first of all, by I'm a disciple of Jesus Christ. And ultimately, everything else falls in line after that. So first of all, I always remind parents, like, hey, when you're having those conversations with your kids, their identity is never wrapped up in their sexuality.
That's right.
And if it is, again, they've got the wrong starting place.
Right. And their identity is not wrapped up in the roles that they play either. A straight A student, an athlete, a skater, a whatever the case may be. Those are all roles that we play, and we may or may not encourage kids to play those roles. But we're we're two things. We're made in God's image and we're redeemed by Him, so we have worth and value. And Brennan Manning said one time, let yourself be defined as one who's radically loved by God. Make that your identity.
Yeah.
Well, that pretty well says it all. And if you can help people see that, then the issue of whether it's sexuality or any other role that they play, that becomes a very secondary kind of thing. So.
Right. The second thing I always try to help the kids and often adults remember is, look, being able to disagree on anything and remain civil and caring is a sign of maturity.
That's right.
And part of the reason I think we struggle with that is because if you don't have a belief that's grounded in truth, you always feel like your belief is being attacked.
Yeah.
If your belief's grounded in truth, it's like, I don't ever argue with anyone that 3 + 3 is 7. Like, I've never had that conversation. And so when someone comes up to me with a crazy belief like that, I'm like, all right, we don't, I love you. You can believe that. We move on. So when someone has a belief that, again, is anti-scripture or something, I don't need to get in an argument. I don't need to be excited about it. Okay. And again, part of the maturity spiritually and emotional health that I present is I'm going to love you regardless. Sure. We don't need to argue about it. If you want to have a conversation, that's fine. And I love the phrase Frank Turek always says, at least with adults, am I allowed to have a different opinion than you?
Right.
Because if I'm not, then we're not going to talk about it. But right. If I'm allowed to have a different opinion, we can talk all day.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. And, we live in a world that, a lot of people talk about acceptance and inclusion, but often our blind spot is where we judge people and part ways based on their belief being different than ours, and that's unfortunate. So.
All right, anything else you would say to, again, our parents or our audience today about this very sensitive subject?
Build a deep relationship with your kids, be able to talk about anything, make it a point to connect with them, accept them for who they are, and yet at the same time, you're going to open doors by building a pattern ahead of time that are going to allow kids to talk about the hard things with you. It makes it's hard enough to talk about sensitive subjects just because they're sensitive. But then, if on top of it, the kid has to worry that they're going to be rejected or judged or criticized or something, then that's not going to help. And it does not mean you have to agree with them. Heavens, that'd be bad news if we agreed all the time with our kids. Then they'd just be doing everything they wanted without any input from anybody.
Right.
So.
And Steve, let me just give you a moment of advertising here. Because I've had a handful of people who watched our previous videos and, hey, how do I get a hold of this guy? So if someone said, hey, I want to bring let me say this first of all. I use Steve as a counselor. My kids have used Steve. My wife uses Steve as a counselor. He's not the only one we use, but again, I wouldn't be here if I didn't think he was excellent. So Steve, if someone wants to get a hold of you, what's the name of the practice here?
We're Christian Counseling Associates. We're at 7049 Taylorsville Road. And the phone number is 937-237-5001. You can call and one of our secretaries will get you scheduled. They're sometimes in more, but it's always pretty dependable. They're in between 9 and 2 on a day-to-day basis. And, if you can leave a message, if you don't get them initially, leave a message, we'll get back with you. And we'll go from there. And I'll look forward to meeting with whoever.
All right. Well, thank you. Anything else you want to say, Steve?
I'm good. I just am glad that I got the opportunity to talk with you and, interact about a subject that most people don't want to interact about.
Right.
Because it's kind of taboo, plus it's also confusing. But I think we can sometimes make it harder on ourselves by saying, oh, that's too sensitive to talk about.
Right. Avoid the subject rather than engage
don't
it.
Avoid it because it's going to come up.
Yes, it is going to come up.
There are not too many people who, never have an issue to talk about there. So.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Hey, blessings, everybody. Thanks for joining in, and have a great day.
Thanks.